We're so proud to be collaborating with our Dreamers Alliance and to be part of the Undocu Student Action Month activities that are happening throughout our district. My name is Sangha Niyogi. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I teach sociology and I co-direct the social justice program with Dr. Albert Ponce. This is our transferable degree program. Always gives me a kick to say that. We are teaching two sections of Introduction to Ethnic Studies, Introduction to Social Justice this semester. One of the sections is taught by Professor Mickey Huff and Dr. Ponce, and the other section is taught by me and Dr. Ponce. So we are team teaching these sections, and the section we are teaching is for educators, and we are learning a lot in the process from our practitioners on the ground. I want to highlight two unique aspects of our program. The first one is that community engagement has always been at the heart of our program, and our speaker series is a big part of that. But we also have a community advisory board with our local organizations, and they help us develop essentially an advancing tiers model of engagement so that students can engage at all different levels. Secondly, we are an interdisciplinary program where our core classes are fixed, but in our electives, we branch out to many different disciplines. So if you need any information on that, you can always reach out to Dr. Ponce and myself. We also believe in collaborating with other programs, so we coordinate quite a bit with our journalism program and with our burgeoning ethnic studies program. We remain committed to developing an independent ethnic studies program at DVC as per our student demands put forth in spring 2019. And so we always like to remind folks, we haven't forgotten our student demands. Our students demanded an independent ethnic studies program much before the state mandates. Last semester, we invited Professor Nelson Maldonado Torres, who cautioned us against juniorizing the field of ethnic studies and treating it as dispensable, dependent, temporary, or even as a threat to other programs and disciplines. So we come from that stance of solidarity. We believe that social justice education has the potential to empower communities, resist and disrupt oppressive power structures, and work for solidarity. Our goal is for students to develop and deepen their understanding of who they are by supporting them in broadening their horizons, building passions, and finding purpose. Youth-led activism is key to building a better world. With breathtaking courage, the Dreamers have helped shape the national debate and fight around immigration. Mexican-American studies students in Tucson and students elsewhere demanding ethnic studies have raised profound questions about whose lives are valued in school curriculum. Now, before we go on with our program today, it is with great pleasure that I invite one of our former DVC student leaders, Kelly Zhao, to say hello and tell us a bit about her project.
Thank you, Professor Niyogi. Well, hi, everyone. It's great to meet everyone. Sorry, I have my mask on because I'm on campus in person right now. But my name is Kelly. I attended DVC from 2016 to 2018. I majored in sociology while I was at DVC, and I actually transferred in 2018 to UCLA and majored in Asian American studies. Right now, I'm actually in the second year of my master's program in Asian American studies. So I'm doing like research. So I ended up like doing research on like community colleges, and specifically right now I'm working on a project on ethnic studies and social justice programs at California community colleges. And I'm looking at how these programs affect like multiracial consciousness, activism, and social movement organizing for students at community colleges. So I'm actually looking for interview participants for this project. And I have a flyer, and I also, I'm looking to interview students from all community colleges to hear about your experiences on how ethnic studies has impacted you. So I'll be dropping my link in the email, in the chat. But also I'm just really excited to be here. And also I love being back. DVC, I was also like a part of the Women of Color Association when I was at DVC. I was the secretary the first year that it started. And it's really great being back in this space. And I'm really looking forward to Dr. Hernàndez's talk today. Yeah, super excited. And I'm also, if any students or anyone has questions about transferring or the transfer process, I'm more than happy to like answer any questions. You can shoot me an email or just like send me a chat. But yeah, I'm super excited to be here, and thank you, Dr. Ponce and Dr. Niyogi, for sharing this space with me. Super grateful to be here. I'm excited. Thank you.
Yeah, we're very proud of Kelly. She's one of our superstars. So very happy to see you back. And now on to my comrade, Dr. Ponce.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to Kelly. It's amazing. And this is what we're here for, right? To provide those, the resources, the pedagogy, and the different methodologies for students to think beyond what the university and the way it was established to train us to think. And we want to think beyond those boundaries. And that's where ethnic studies is at the avant-garde of that movement, to really, and it is the ground that allows for us to build new forms of knowledges, and not necessarily new, but those that have been covered over by forms of power historically outside of the mainstream disciplines, such as where I come from, where I was trained political science. And normally at this time, you know, there's been within this field where people acknowledge the land that we exist on right now in this virtual space. But one of the things, Diablo Valley College was, again, as all universities, taken from indigenous peoples. And we acknowledge the people, and we go through this process of acknowledgement. But one of the things that, you know, it becomes to be sort of performative, right? Where we just acknowledge the land, move on now with the show. But what we're really engaged in is a struggle for, you know, how are we going to reallocate the land that we exist on? How are we going to reallocate, redistribute the land, or the land back to those populations to be stewards of that land? And that's something that we need, that I think we should all engage in beyond the mere performance of land acknowledgement, is to say, yes, the Bay Miwok people existed on this land. And now what are we going to do about that? So I just want to leave us with the question more than an acknowledgement, right, to move forward. Because I think we've all sat through those, and then we move on to the discussion. But I'm really honored today to introduce our special guest, to continue our discussion on the importance of ethnic studies and this movement that we're very proud of here in California. Again, leading the nation, leading the world, right? We tried to think about the institutionalization, right? I use that word kind of loosely, of ethnic studies as a domain to think and to build and to transform social, political, and economic relations as a whole. That's the pivot. Roberto D. Hernàndez is an associate professor of Chicana and Chicano studies at San Diego State University. He was raised within blocks of the San Isidro port of entry at the US-Mexico border. The US-Mexico border has figured prominently in his academic, intellectual, and political development and commitments. His research and public work focus on racial, colonial, and border violence, memory, monumentalization, decolonial political theory, and the geopolitics of knowledge and cultural production. He is the director of the Decolonizing Knowledge and Power Summer Institute in Barcelona, Spain, and current chair of the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies, NACS. He was previously an at-large member of the same NACS board in 2010 and was involved in the writing of an amicus brief in support of the Tucson teachers that were mentioned by Dr. Niyogi at the height of the legal battle over the attempted banning of Mexican-American studies in Arizona in 2010. He is the author of Coloniality of the US-Mexico Border, Power, Violence, and the Decolonial Imperative, in 2018 and co-editor of the anthology Decolonizing the Westernized University, Interventions in Philosophy of Education from Within and Without. Lastly, Dr. Hernàndez is an accomplished translator of important scholarly works and has several ongoing translation projects underway. So let's all, as I ask us all to do, unmute and let's do give him a warm round of applause. Dr. Hernàndez, floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Ponce and Dr. Niogi, for the welcoming introduction. Na nutoka Roberto Hernàndez, Nochantis, San Diego, Kumia Itlali, Nanansi, Ewa, Wirarikatlali, Tatatsin Ewa, Mantlali, Nilse Yupa, Marco Miai. Good evening, everyone. My name is Roberto Hernàndez. I am currently in San Diego, Kumeyaay territory. I bring you greetings from Kumeyaay land here. I want to acknowledge as well, those of you there, imagine in Bay Miwok, Muecma, and surrounding Xocheño, Loning territories. I spent many years up in the Bay, so it's always happy to have anything to do, any association with the Bay Area. I'm in many ways a second home of mine. I come on my mother's side from Huirarica territory in west central Mexico, and on my father's side from Mam territory, which is the southern state of Chiapas, border with Guatemala. I begin in this way, in part as Dr. Ponce was mentioning, to highlight, the need for not only land acknowledgements, but the building of relationships, right? We, in Chicano and Chicano studies, we've been doing land acknowledgements 20 plus years. It's interesting to see how now universities are finally catching on, right? But beyond that, right, the stewardship of the land, returning land, and building relationships is key, and it's at the heart of the way that I've come to know ethnic studies as a discipline, ethnic studies as not only an intellectual, but a political project as well. And as I'll be sharing a little bit today, what I will talk about in terms of, if I could get this PowerPoint here, ethnic studies as crisis, California public education and the roads ahead. Now, by way of introduction, it was mentioned that I grew up within San Isidro, blocks from the border wall. As you could see on these two pictures, San Isidro is south of San Diego. In a lot of my work, I point to San Diego as not a border city, because quite the contrary, it's 15, 20 minutes north of the border. And the real border is really San Isidro and Tijuana. On the right-hand side of your screen is an image of the border wall as it goes, sticks 100 yards into the Pacific Ocean, creating rip currents for people who try to swim across it, many injuring, if not perishing at that site. So the houses and the stadium, there's a bullfighting ring. This is on the Tijuana side, whereas San Isidro is the barren side. Towards the top left-hand corner, you have San Isidro proper in the port of entry. So when describing and situating myself, I often say I'm from the border and went to Berkeley and came back again to San Diego. And this has really informed a lot of the work and some of what I'll share with you today. More specifically, I'm also a product of what some refer to as a generation of 94. At the time, the generation of 94, this was the idea around Proposition 187 and a series of anti-immigrant legislation in California. But it wasn't just 187. Within 2 years, we had Prop 209, abolishing affirmative action. We had 184, which was the 3 strikes you're law out, which increased felonies, primarily affecting Black and Brown people across California. So it also became a moment of heightened social movement activity. Many would say that after the height of the movements in the 60s and 70s, that is in this generation of 94, that we saw a resurgence of social movement activity. However, rather than generation of 94, I think it's best to situate it or situate myself as part of what I would say is the generation of 92/94, if you will. And by 92, this is a reference to, not only the walkouts that were happening later in 94, but in 1992, around the 500 years of Columbus, indigenous people, not only in the US, but the continent over, began to gather in anticipation of the 500 years to put into question, what do we do, right? It's nothing to celebrate. How do we respond to Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese fighting each other over claiming Columbus, right? So here in San Diego specifically, there was major protests as well. The flyer you see on the far left is actually of the first ever Indigenous Peoples Day there in Berkeley. Berkeley holds that distinction of being the first, now 30 years past, to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. But here in San Diego, when it came to the quincentennial and the protests against the quincentennial, people, we didn't go protest in Little Italy. We didn't go protest in Discovery Park, formerly called Discovery Park. It was just recently renamed. Statue of Columbus removed. I'm actually on the city commission for the renaming of the park. So that's current ongoing work here locally. But we instead marched on October 10th, which was the weekend of 1992. We marched on the US-Mexico border in San Isidro, the San Isidro-Tijuana border. And we went there because for us here living in the borderlands, it was very clear in and through our lived experience that the border had everything to do with 500 years, with Columbus, with the advent of colonization and the eventual creation or rise of the modern nation states and the territorial borders as the demarcators of territorial boundaries. I then went to Berkeley in 97 and was myself very involved with the TWLF formation, Liberation Front in 1999. So as you may have learned, those of you who were part of the talk with Dr. Maldonado Torres, Berkeley Ethnic Studies is one of the departments along with San Francisco State that first created ethnic studies through the Third World Liberation Front in '69. So by '99, 30 years later, budget cuts had affected the department to the point that from our perspectives as students at the time, I was only a second year undergrad, we were witnessing right before our very eyes the dismantling, or if you will, the starving of ethnic studies, an attempt to let it die off through retirements and deaths, faculty deaths. And so it was in that context that many of us took the banner of the Third World Liberation Front, named ourselves in the same way as those that came before us in '69, and led a semester-wide campaign, protests, sit-ins, walkouts, rallies, press conferences, what have you, that ultimately culminated in an 8-day hunger strike in outside of California Hall, which is the office of the Berkeley chancellor. And out of this strike, we were able to get 8 faculty hires, a research center, multicultural center, among other things. But in many ways, we saved ethnic studies. We didn't necessarily build more because we only managed to regain the things that had been lost over the previous 30 years. So I say that because it raises a question, why crisis, right? The tendency for us to think crisis is a bad thing, right? In 1999, we were saying ethnic studies is at a crisis. We need to do something, but really, crisis is important that we recognize is really more of a critical juncture, right? A moment of decisive action where we don't know if it's going to be bad, right? It could actually lead to something generative, something good, something positive. And in many ways, that is where we are today in California, 50 years out, 20 years out from the 99 strike, where we now have the CSU requirement. We are now, about to get a high school ethnic studies requirement and possibly community college requirement. So the crisis can also be a positive moment if it's handled properly, right? And that's what I'll turn to in the latter half. But crisis also speaks to the history of the unfolding of the university itself as an institution. And what I mean by that is that the university as an institution whose enterprise is the production and circulation of knowledge is one that has always been affected by different material crises unfolding in the world. And in particular, if we look at 1492, right, being that I think the importance of not just 92, as I emphasized before, but 1492 as the beginnings of the modern colonial world as we know it, this also led to a crisis in the university, right? I think Dr. Maldonado Torres spoke to this in terms of the secularization of the university, where you have a growing divide between different fields of knowledge that really mark the beginnings of modern philosophy and a separation with religion, religiosity, theology, and the idea that modern philosophers hold the access to the truth, right? And whereas religion, philosophy is a domain of, dealing with the divine, with the aspirational, but not really with actual truth. A few centuries later, we have a second crisis, a crisis that on the one hand, again, is not just negative, it's generative. It is a scientific turn in which we have the advent of the hard sciences, but this also manifests itself in the university as a tripartite divide between, again, religion and philosophy, now more broadly conceived as the humanities, letters, and so on, with hard sciences as a new field of knowledge. Now, in terms of the unfolding of the material processes in the world, we have the French Revolution and the rise of nation states, and this leads to the advent of the social sciences. Now, I'll come back to this in particular for what it means for thinking about ethnic studies and the role of disciplinary divides in the universities today. But what I'll then turn to is the beginnings of ethnic studies in what I would say is the latest crisis or the current crisis, which really goes back to what people like Samir Amin, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Giovanni Arrighi, and others have referred to as the global revolution of '68. And this global revolution of 1968 speaks to a moment not only of social movements unfolding, Mexico, Japan, Paris, the world over is in upheaval, right? Due both to economic restructuring, the industrialization, but also, broader changes in the social character of the up till then dominant nation states who had held the idea of the nation state as a cohesive unit, and that begins to fracture in what we see as the rise of cultural struggle. But I also want us to challenge this idea simply 68, 70s as solely cultural struggle, and instead think about a broader challenge to the structures of knowledge that uphold the modern colonial world. It is there where ethnic studies became an initial crisis at the level of knowledge production, but now in the context of victories around ethnic studies, is presenting a different type of crisis, which I'll get to. Now, it's important before going on to note that in terms of the French Revolution, the social sciences, we see this reflected in the modern university in terms of the creation of the original three areas of social science, which were seen as domains in which to study what was seen as three separate spheres of the modern liberal nation state. So if the state is divided into the state, the market, and civil society as presumably separate spheres of activity, you have political science to study the state, economics to study the market, sociology to study civil society. So you may ask yourself, what about the other disciplines? That is, definitely a much longer story, one that I'll only be able to touch on in a cursory way in terms of different debates between social sciences and the humanities, for example, in terms of history and where does history belong, if it has a scientific bent or if it's more humanistic in terms of trying to understand the human experience. Many authors have written about anthropology as a field of study that itself, I will say this, and no offense to any anthropology majors, but if we look at the history of anthropology, it's no secret that it's very much a colonial construction, a colonial enterprise that was created by Western countries to study the quote unquote primitive others that they were going and discovering or finding in their new colonial territories. And now anthropology has gone through many changes and has become very self-reflective, although there's still impulses of that colonial anthropology in some places. I would say after 19, in the late 80s, there was a publication of a book called The Remaking of Social Analysis that changed the field of anthropology. And I mention it only to say that the author of that book, Renato Rosaldo, was someone who was both in anthropology, but tied to the beginnings of what was in ethnic studies and Chicano studies in particular. So it took someone from Chicano studies to eventually help trigger challenges and changes within anthropology. Now, area studies is different, and I do want to take a moment to mention area studies. In that, area studies is what we tend to think of as Latin American studies, Middle Eastern studies, even Asian studies. In my campus here at San Diego State, we actually have what is called Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, right? We don't have an actual Asian American studies, although we're in the process of building one. But it's important to mention area studies as distinct from ethnic studies, precisely because they speak to two very competing interests. Area studies, if we look at the history of the formation of area studies, they become a modern way of thinking about, in particular, Britain and the US, thinking about what up to then in the 1950s had been previous colonies that are now seeking their independence, right? If some of the premises of anthropology were that the third world was backward, primitive, stuck in the past, not changing, right? That you could look at the third world and study the West's past, because the assumption was these people were stuck in time. By the time of the decolonial movements, the decolonization struggles of the 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, many of these colonies begin breaking away from their colonial empires. And so area studies becomes a way for the West, and began first in Britain and then the US, to study these newly independent former colonies, in these very regionally constructed manners, Middle Eastern studies, African studies, Latin American studies. But what this tells you is that the lens that was being used was one of a top-down lens to understand the decolonizing third world, and really in the service of the state, in the service of intelligence agencies, in the service of the State Department, in the service of Western states that are now trying to make sense of these former colonies that are now seeking their independence. This is area studies. Again, much like anthropology, they have gone through many internal transformations. Some are still very much tied to State Department money. Some are still very much top down. But others have, began to do some important critical work. But the lens has always remained one of from the West top down, and at best, a more behavior, if you will, now moving into philanthropy and the likes, and how to, help develop the third world, as a positive thing, as opposed to how to crisis manage the decolonization movements. But nevertheless, the point is that it's not ethnic studies, right? It's epistemically different in that it has been about this top-down Western gaze, as opposed to ethnic studies, which from its foundation has always been about solidarity precisely with these decolonization movements, has been about bottom up, about thinking about the experiences not only of communities of color in the US, but of peoples the world over that have been subjected to histories of colonization, domination, enslavement, kidnapping, transporting, what have you, right? And it's in this vein too that we get women's studies, gender studies, queer studies, is trying to understand not just the history and contributions of diverse populations. I want to be very, very pointed about this. It's not just about the histories and contributions of diverse populations, but it is about knowledge production that is being produced from the social historical experiences of diverse populations. Now that's an important distinction to make as well, because if we only think in terms of histories and contributions, then we get a celebratory multiculturalism that's very superficial. It's about what foods do you eat? What holidays do you celebrate? It is now Hispanic Heritage Month. Let's all wear calaveras and disrespect Day of the Dead, which is not Halloween, right? This is what you get with multicultural education and diversity, which again is epistemically not ethnic studies. So ethnic studies is more than just simply the history of different groups. It is about the knowledge they produce on their own terms, drawing from their own social historical experiences. Now, this takes on an added dimension. If we look at the history of traditional disciplines, where we see that the majority of the writings, especially the canonical writings, the main texts, the classic texts that you read in most disciplines, whether it be sociology, economics, or anthropology, even philosophy for that matter, tend to be texts where the writers come from at most 5 countries. We're looking at the main writers, the main canonical writers across these disciplines. They tend to come from 5 different countries: Britain, Germany, Italy, the US, and France. Occasionally you get an Italian that makes the cut, but not only that, most of these tend to be men. So if we do a rough demographic of the world's population of these 5 countries, we're talking 12% of the world's population. And if most of these authors are mostly men, right? So you'll get Simone de Beauvoir, an occasional woman author in some of these canonical texts. In reality, what we're talking about is knowledge being produced from the social historical experience of 6% of the world's population. that we take as universal, as applying everywhere, that everyone is just supposed to learn it and apply it to their own reality. So when I say that ethnic studies is about more than just the histories and contributions of these groups, it's about recognizing that the knowledge is produced by the remaining 94% of the social historical experiences of the world's population. Right? This is when we talk about Eurocentrism and white supremacy. It's not about just singling out certain knowledge or certain peoples. It's not about peoples. This is about social historical processes. It's about recognizing that the processes of the material unfolding of the modern colonial world and its reflection in the university system led to a situation where the knowledge that we're supposed to learn across every discipline tends to come from the social historical experiences of those 6% of the world's population. So Eurocentrism has a very specific paper trail, a very specific history that we could document. It's not just a catchphrase, right? It's an actual process that we saw unfold through not just the advent of the modern university, but its own transformations, right? Even in its critical moments, it's just internal critiques, yet still coming from within those 6% of the world's social historical experiences. Now, I've given an initial idea here then how I approach ethnic studies, or what I think the broader contributions of ethnic studies are, but I want to get into a little bit more detail. And let's see. Okay, so here, let's see. Some of these points I've been addressing already, right? But I'll try to unpack them a bit further, right? So ethnic studies is not only a discipline, but an epistemic and pedagogical approach that is equity-driven and culturally relevant. It is more than just the histories of marginalized groups. It is about the knowledge production emanating from those who have been historically excluded from the university. And by this, right, just to reiterate the point, it is not just that they've been physically excluded from the university in terms of being an actual presence in the university, but they have been epistemically excluded in the sense that knowledge is being produced by the rest of the 96% of the world's population has not had a space within college curriculums. And ethnic studies then is about tackling social historical processes, not peoples, right? There is a tendency when we talk about white supremacy, Eurocentrism, heteropatriarchy to say, oh, you're singling out white people, you're singling out white men in particular. This is not about you, right? This is not about peoples. This is about social historical processes and the implications they have for understanding the world today. As such, ethnic studies is a recognition of the entanglement of structures of knowledge with diverse forms of power. It is therefore important to add that ethnic studies as a discipline is not additive. What do I mean by this? It is not enough to simply maintain the structures of knowledge of the university as we know them today and add a unit or a few readings on culture or race to existing curriculum and say you do ethnic studies. No, you need to fundamentally transform the curriculum from start to finish in order to actually begin to get at ethnic studies. It is not about adding exotic colors or flavors to subject matter, but challenging the fundamental underpinnings of the structures of knowledge. And as I've mentioned already, it is not area studies in that the two have fundamentally different lens, a top-down lens, whether in the service of the state or from the perspective of a savior mentality that comes in, to save the poor little brown people, if you will. But rather, instead, ethnic studies has that bottom-up lens that draws from the experiences of these communities themselves as the locus from which to produce knowledge. It is therefore also important to say that ethnic studies is not anti-racism or anti-racist education. And here, you know, it may seem like I differ a bit with Dr. Maldonado Torres, right, in that he emphasized the anti-racist competencies, if I remember correctly from his talk, as a way of thinking of ethnic studies. But I want to make a more nuanced point in that, in saying, you know, there's a lot of the advent right now, a lot of work around anti-racism in our institutions, in the university and otherwise. But for me, you know, I don't really like this framing of anti-racism, because ultimately it's solely about opposing. You have racism and you're opposing racism. You're anti-racist. Okay, that's fine. But your point of departure for making sense of yourself is still racism, as opposed to trying to build a different world, right? A good colleague and friend of mine down here in San Diego, who wrote an amazing book called Pagans of the Promised Land. He writes, or actually didn't write it in the book, but in conversation with him, we're talking about colonization and his work around the doctrine of discovery. And he said, it's not enough to just think outside the box, but what we need to do is we need to realize that there is no box. There is the idea of a box. And to the extent that we keep saying we oppose the box, we're already restricting ourselves to the world of the box, right? So if racism is a box and we're saying, okay, we're going to challenge it because we're outside the box, we're still being defined by the box. So how do we begin? And this is where I think it's important to talk about abolition, right? It's not just abolishing racism or abolishing, you know, in the sense of destroying or undoing, but recognize that abolition is a creative project. To recognize that abolition also means not just, you know, being against racism, but rather the dismantling of the conditions of possibility that allow for racism to exist. And that is a positive project. That is a productive project. That is a project of building a different type of world, of building different types of social relations. However, if we go back to, let's say 1993, and protests that began playing out, you'll see I keep coming back to 92, 93, 94. In 93, you had very important protests in Seattle against the World Trade Organization. You had the rise that was seen as a anti-globalization movement. But within this movement, although it was very diverse, in many ways, a lot of the leadership or non-leadership, right? Because these were horizontal movements that renounced leadership, yet nevertheless in practice, a lot of the people involved as that were the voices that were coming out of this moment in Seattle, were still reproducing the 6% knowledge production being produced from the social historical experiences of 6% of the world's population. Even if critical of globalization, even if critical of capitalism, what were they saying? They were saying another world is possible. Yes, another world is possible. I don't want to undercut that. But what I want to say instead is that if we recognize ethnic studies as knowledge production emanating from the social historical experiences of the other 96% of the world's population, then we would know that another world is not only possible, but another world already exists. Another world exists with the Zapatistas in Chiapas, with the Ohlone up in Huixin, Bay Miwok, in their attempts to take care of their land, here with the Kumia and the relationships we built with them. These other worlds are already there. It is just a matter of us never taking seriously not only the knowledge being produced, but the social relations, the practices. Now, mind you, we also got to be careful. It's not about romanticizing other parts of the world, indigenous, African, or otherwise. Even there, we also have problems. And so we also need to then make a further distinction of ethnic studies, not simply as any knowledge emanating from that 96%, because some of it could actually be, quite internalized, internalized colonialism. Some of it could be very patriarchal. Some of it could be very homophobic. So instead, what we need to look at is making distinctions between critical positions that come from the 96% of the world's population. And for that matter, critical positions also from that other 6%, right? In no way is ethnic studies saying or about not engaging with European thinkers, European scholars, white thinkers, white scholars, men thinkers, men scholars, not at all. But it is how do we draw from the critical positions that emerge from the various different social historical positions, white and non-white included. That is ethnic studies. And that is not multicultural education, right? It is not just including those voices of previously marginalized people, but maintaining the structures in place. And so it bears mentioning by I guess here as I try to bring some of this to a close, that ethnic studies is also not DEI. And I imagine most of you might have a working sense of what DEI is, because it seems to be all the rage in the universities now, right? And for those of you not familiar with DEI, it is the idea of diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives. And so I want to say what I mean by, excuse me here, by it is not DEI. Lately, there's been a growing I would say industry, administrative-led industry of DEI initiatives, which again, don't get me wrong, some of these are well-intentioned, but they become ultimately about crisis management. They become about managing this current crisis, the crisis initiated with the global revolution of '68 that made the realization of the diverse experiences of peoples of the world, brought it to the forefront, no longer could be ignored, began to see the challenges to Eurocentrism, to patriarchy, to sexism, to the heteronormativity that was at the core of the modern Western university. And it's in that context that we create ethnic studies. And it's in the pushing for ethnic studies that now, only 50 years later, we're finally seeing the extended fruits of these struggles for ethnic studies. But just as we're beginning to see all these victories and the expansion of ethnic studies, we are now also being bombarded with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that in essence, I would argue here, are about course correction, right? Meaning they're about trying to deal with the crisis of how do we manage all these diverse populations that are insisting on ethnic studies, that are insisting on women's studies, that are insisting on gender studies, that are insisting on critical lenses that challenge the core, fundamental core of the university. And instead, the DEI has positioned itself as this top-down neoliberal management scheme that has attempted to water down what has been the critical impulses of ethnic studies. And not only that, in many ways, it even attempts to draw elements from ethnic studies, some of the critical positions coming from ethnic studies, some of the language coming from ethnic studies, to make itself seem attentive to these issues yet ultimately at a very superficial level. And in particular, if we think about the locus of enunciation, and by that I mean where one speaks from, we see that even in these initiatives, the locus of enunciation is still that of a predominantly white institution, finally coming to grips with the diversity that, by the way, has always been there. People didn't just land from outer space in the last 50 years. Diversity is a social fact. We've always had diversity. The question is, we've never, one, acknowledged it or valued it. So it's not about a newfound reality in the University of Diversity. Diversity is a reality way before any DEI initiative. But when we say inclusion, we're still saying the white institution is now being very generous and finally including these diverse people into the universities. The locus of enunciation, the place from which these initiatives speak from, still maintain that of the university as being generous to all these folks of color and finally letting us in. And equity, right? I mean, although equity is important, right? I don't want to undercut that. You cannot have equity if you maintain the very structures of these historically PWIs in place and only see yourself as being benevolent in admitting historically marginalized people, right? But still maintaining the same structures in place. So as early as the Third World Liberation Front, as early as the Plan de Santa Bárbara, that was a founding document for the Chicana and Chicano studies, there was already these concerns and warnings around co-optation that in many ways we're seeing now with some of these DEI initiatives. Now the irony, and I'll conclude here with two examples, is that in the push for all the DEI efforts at various campuses, many who oppose the initiatives as a whole are actually, critiquing ethnic studies and equating them as one and the same, thinking it's ethnic studies pushing these top-down diversity initiatives when the two are, again, conceptually, epistemically distinct projects. And we need to recognize that distinction. These are two very distinct projects. And so we see, for example, I'll speak about my campus, the inclusion of the language of intersectionality. I sit on my university's curriculum committee, on the college curriculum committee, and in the last couple of years, we saw a course that was called, from the sociology department, and it was the Sociology of Intersectionality. And I looked at the syllabus, and not only did it not have any, hardly any scholars of color, any scholars that developed the concept of intersectionality. Instead, it was a semester on economic inequality, gender inequality, racial inequality, 3 different units, but still separate. So the language of intersectionality made it into the title to try to bring people in because, intersectionality is now a thing, right? That the ethnic studies has helped put on the map. But the course was still fundamentally a traditional inequality course in that it didn't recognize how these 3 forms of inequality, economic, racial, and gender, might function together to produce different possibilities and life outcomes for people that are differently racialized, genderized, or working class, right? Instead, it still maintained them separate. Now, we're still getting the brunt saying, oh, it's ethnic studies pushing all this diversity stuff. But the last example that I'll use to conclude is that, first of all, I want to commend you all for ethnic studies advances you've made in your districts. We here not only have at San Diego State gotten the ethnic studies requirement at the CSU level, but we also have a second ethnic studies requirement that we passed at the campus level. So we actually have 2 ethnic studies requirements. when it became clear, because there was some confusion to whether AB 1460 superseded the campus one, it became clear that the university president and the Senate was going to recognize us as having two requirements instead of one. There was complaints from some traditional departments about ethnic studies double dipping, right? That we would be getting too many students because now we're getting some students from a diversity requirement and some students through the ethnic studies requirement. And while legitimate, these concerns about double dipping, what we did as ethnic studies is we actually withdrew all of our courses from the diversity requirement. And we said, you know what, we don't want the diversity requirement because that's never been what we do anyways. What we do in ethnic studies is conceptually different. Go ahead and keep your diversity requirements, pat yourselves on the back about doing diversity from the lens of a predominantly white university, but ethnic studies will no longer be a diversity requirement because if anything, we want to mark ever more clearly the conceptual differences between diversity initiatives and ethnic studies. So that's what we did. That's where we stand today. As we continue to build, this year alone, we have 6 different hires in Chicano studies, 2 in Asian American studies, Africana studies, Native American studies. We're doing this work 50 years late, 50 years in the making, but we must embrace this moment of crisis and be productive with it, but at the same time, be clear in making those distinctions from DEI and other diversity initiatives that will only lead us into the road of multicultural education, co-optation, watering down, and so on. So I believe this is the last slide. I'll say, Ehan, Tlasukamati, gracias, shukran. Thank you all for joining us today.
And thank you. Wow, there's a lot there. And I'm just taking a lot of the lessons that we can apply here in trying to build something from scratch. And yes, over 50 years, too late, but we're not looking on that in a negative sense. And we see crisis, as you pointed out, as being opening up those possibilities, right, to really build something. And these are some of the lessons that we here at DVC are really taking from our students who demanded that ethnic studies, that robust program, standalone, not to take any course that exists on campus that is and cross-listed immediately just so we can fill the seats and send students on their way and check off that DEI list. We really want to provide an education that's transformative, that is true to, as you mentioned, 94% of the global population that has not been recognized in its full extent. But yet, as somebody's pointed out in the chat, the internalization of the forms of knowledge that even those of us of color, once we enter the university, we take on those forms of knowing, right? So we too have to do away with that internal colonial mindset that I am a political scientist. No, I am not, right? I am a theorist, someone who theorizes and who thinks from where I came from. And for that, because we've been thinking all along, yet never acknowledged. So thank you, Dr. Hernàndez, for speaking personally to me, and it made me reflect a lot. But now we want to open it up. And Sangha, do you want to say anything?
No, I just wanted to really thank you from the bottom of our hearts to make it so accessible, to help us understand. I can tell you're a great teacher, Professor Hernàndez, because I hope it is much clearer for our community what we're fighting for when we say an independent and robust ethnic studies program. So just that historical context was very helpful. And as folks can put their questions in the chat or ask Professor Hernàndez directly. As Albert mentioned, we are in the middle of it right now. And my question to you would be something that we are dealing with at DVC for sure, is how do we guard against that co-optation? So on the one hand, we do want ethnic studies accessible to all our students, that all our students have this honest experience of what ethnic studies is. At the same time, the processes that are in place are through our guided pathways initiatives and other structures and processes in place. So on the one hand, we want to institutionalize ethnic studies and give everybody that opportunity to have access to how the other 94% think and see themselves reflected in that knowledge and so on. At the same time, how do we guard against that co-optation?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Nyogi. I mean, I think that's always been both the task and the challenge, right? And I mentioned in particular what was a founding document of Chicano studies, the Plan de Santa Barbara, and in it, it did already 1969 have a section warning against the possibilities of co-optation, but it is one that I would say might sound kind of counterintuitive, but it also speaks to how we sometimes have reified a distinction between the community and the university as distinct spaces. And on the contrary, I think we have to not only walk a fine line between the two, right, in terms of maintaining these robust programs grounded in the broader community concerns, but we have to begin to further dispel that distinction, right? If the university is supposed to be a place of learning, a place of producing and circulating knowledge, then how do we, make that be the case, not so in an elite way, only for political and economic elite classes, but how do we do that for everyone, right? How do we recognize that there's knowledge producers amongst not only cultural workers, artists, but our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our relatives at home, and the work that they do, whether it be in construction or gardening. I mean, there's tips to the trade, right? These are also forms of knowledge that have been passed down across generations, right? So we have to have that groundedness, but we also have to not shy away from being in those meetings, in those administrative meetings that could be such a drag. But if we just say we're all about community and the hell with those meetings, then whoever's in those meetings are going to make of ethnic studies whatever they want. So I hate to say it, but we have to be in those meetings, right? We have to be active in our own campus administrative structures, but we have to insist on doing ethnic studies on our own terms. Right? Ultimately, that's what it comes down to, not allowing the terms to be determined from those who would seek to simply manage the crisis and do it towards minimal ends, right? Towards minimizing what we do. Now, an important point to this that I really want to highlight is that there's a tendency right now to also think, well, California's changing, the demographics are so differently. That's why we need ethnic studies. And I really want to warn against that argument, because it does two things. It assumes that that ethnic studies is only relevant now and it wasn't relevant 50 years ago. 50 years ago, the demographics looked very differently. There wasn't that many people of color in the universities. But guess what? Ethnic studies was just as relevant then as it was now, as it is now. So the second thing is that if we allow it to simply become an argument about changing demographic realities, or as the saying goes, demography is future, right? The idea that that because of demographics, it'll just naturally or inevitably change in that direction, then we're leaving it to the whims of administrators and detractors of ethnic studies. And guess what? Demography will not be future, right? We have to recognize the righteousness of the demand for ethnic studies, whether we're 60% of the population or 10% of the population, right? That it was as righteous then as it is today. It's not just about the numbers, but for that to actually have any teeth, it means we have to not shy away from being in those spaces of decision making.
Thank you. So now we want to open it up. Any students, you can just either raise your hand, drop your question in the chat, any comment, however you feel comfortable. Asking any question. You can just type it in if you feel more comfortable in the chat.
Questions, comments, or chistes, quejas, I'll take them all.
Yeah, and any complaints, any critiques? Okay, we have one in the chat, and I'll come to you, Louise, second. So Sean, do you want to, as well as, he was asking where the Zoom meeting. Okay, I'll drop that in the chat in a bit. So Louise, you can go ahead and if you want to unmute.
Yeah, I'm listening and really, resonating with what our speaker is saying. We're, I'm doing this DEI initiative at my daughter's high school, and one comment the students made, this was the student leaders of the DEI group. She said, we want to get to the point, because they're trying to get an ethnic studies class, or they already have an ethnic studies class that they got approved by the high school. So we're kind of starting there. I know this isn't the college level where you guys are, but this is important because this is where this is starting, and the students are even asking it in these very white districts. And, they said at some point, and we want to get to the point where we don't even need an ethnic studies class, because we just want to, I think they were trying to say, we just want to honor all these cultures inherently within our knowledge base in our classes. But I want to talk about this process because, and it's unbelievable how the years, like, that's what I like about this talk, that it starts way back, and it's just taking forever to make these changes. But at the same time, we have to go through this, as I guess what I'm saying. We have to go through this. It's how else do you approach these structures if you don't start somewhere? And maybe it's just a frustration of like, it's just taking forever and it's too long. But I was interested in what the students said. We want to get to the point where we don't have to have an ethnic studies class. And I thought, whoa, we just started this thing, in the last year. We have to start somewhere. So we can comment on that. You can riff on that however you want.
No, I totally appreciate the comment, the sentiment. It seems counterintuitive, but I actually just had the same discussion in my Intro to Chicano Studies course, where, I forget how we went down that pathway, but ultimately, I told the students that, you won't necessarily hear this from any other university faculty, but I want to get to the point where I teach myself out of a job, where ethnic studies no longer exists, where ethnic studies is no longer necessary, because it'll be only then that we will have transformed the curriculum enough to say that we no longer need it. But for the time being, we do need it, right? And for lack of better terms, in terms of the long history, it took over 500 years to get us to this point, that to build up the current structures of knowledge that we have, it's not going to be resolved, with a few more conferences or guest speakers, right? I mean, it's going to entail a lot of work. Now, oftentimes, that busy work, that administrative work, is not luxurious kind of thing. I began by mentioning my involvement in the third world. During that time, we had hundreds of people in any given day, sometimes even thousands of people. We had not thousands of people come out to all these protests and rallies, and they were there for all the action, if you will. But after the hunger strike, which we won, if you will, we dwindled down to a group of no more than 10 to 15 people who actually stuck through seeing the implementation of the agreement. I personally was one of those people who stuck around to do the implementation work. Not only, I did my undergrad at Berkeley, but in many ways, I chose to stay at Berkeley for my PhD because I recognize that the university also relies on students coming and going, right? Students graduating in 2, 4, sometimes 6 years or what have you, or not graduating at all and leaving. And because the university is structured in that way, it becomes easy to not follow up on agreements, right? So even as a second year student, when I was asked to be on the negotiating team during the hunger strike, I actually made it a point to not be on the negotiating team, and told them, put these on, be able to become replaceable. And by that, I mean, be able to have younger generations carry on with the work when we graduate, drop out, or what have you, right? I mean, because the universities or the high schools, if you will, rely on these cycles of 4 to 6 years, it's easy to not keep up their part of the agreements. And that's where for me, it's important to think not just in terms of youth, but always intergenerationally, right? We always have to be building intergenerational models to help support us across the long haul.
And I just want to finish up by saying, it was really the students, and this is high school students, who are requesting and demanding this. So that's a good sign.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I see the comment from Margarita, right? People show up for protests, fundraisers, but don't stick around to do the work afterwards. And while that is true, I guess I also want to share, just, I guess, as frustrating as it be, it's also important to not become bitter or angry about that, or dismissive of those that don't stick around. Different people have different capacities, different skill sets that come in handy in different ways. Some are maybe just good for the numbers, and that's okay, right? Because then I have an elder here in San who's been a veteran from the Chicano movement, but he's so bitter, he's always complaining about nobody ever comes around, and he's so grumpy that no one really wants to engage with him. And then it just reinforces itself, right? No one comes around because you're a one-man show and you're grumpy and no one wants to work with you. So then you make your own complaints true, right? So don't become that person. Recognize everyone's different contributions.
Yeah, Margarita, you can go ahead and unmute. You wanted to say something?
Sure, thank you. This has been wonderful. So, entonces, saludos a todos de Borinquen. Hello to everybody. I'm speaking live from Puerto Rico, and I want to acknowledge that this is the land of my ancestors, the land of the Taino people, and I do a lot of work surrounding the decolonization of Puerto Rico. So it is right now the oldest colony still in existence of the United States. So I just want to recognize that, and that's why I have a degree in the Raza Studies from SF State before it became Latina Studies, which it kind of took away the politicized nature of the word raza, right? But anyway, I just want to, speaking of the decolonization and my work, and I do a lot of work in the Bay Area. I do a lot of work for Puerto Rico, and I try not to get discouraged, but it's really it's hard because people come to my protests or fundraisers, but people don't come around. But thank you for speaking on that. I try not to get frustrated, but it's hard. So I guess what I'm thinking about is I'm wondering, so I have the Raza Studies degree and I have just the bachelor's, and I'm just trying to figure out like my next steps. I don't know if this is a whole other side question, but what I can do to look into master's or maybe even a PhD program.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the values of ethnic studies, right, because historically it's also always been a question, well, what are you going to do with that degree? And I think even that question already kind of frames it in this way that makes us junior partners to the university, right? And so in our department, we've actually made it a point to reframe that and say, well, what can't you do with ethnic studies? Quite the contrary, right? If we look at ethnic studies, it positions you in such a way where you can go to grad school, you can go to law school, you can go to med school, right? You could go social worker, teach. The opportunities are endless, and if anything, recognize on and own it that you've been able to engage in a field of study that has better prepared you for the realities of this world, right? And so when we start to doubt our own ethnic studies degrees is when we internalize the idea that somehow it's secondary to the real quote unquote disciplines. Quite the contrary. So I would say just, whatever it is that you do want to pursue, own it, right? Authorize your damn self, right? Don't wait for anyone to tell you, oh, you can do this, you can do that. You can do whatever you want, just not everything. You can't do everything and stretch yourself thin, but you can definitely do anything.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'd like to, lately I've been talking to so many young people. I've even inspired a younger cousin who speaks no Spanish to come back to Puerto Rico for the first time and do a work exchange program here. And I'm interested in helping youth. So I want to go on the route of education. So so someone invited me here to listen in. So I appreciate taking us all in and pa'lante, siempre pa'lante. Gracias.
Thank you. So is there anyone else who has a question? We have time for one or two more. And I think this last response really speaks to I think that's a way to really think about reframing the possibilities, right, for the profession that the university trains students for. It's like now, we were just having this discussion earlier, it's about education and what can't you do? You can do anything that you want to. And now you're elevating ethnic studies to the level of where it ought to be.
Yeah, if I could just add one more thing to that is that, especially when you go the PhD route, usually the tendency is education and becoming instructor or researcher somewhere. Now, the irony is that with some of the traditional disciplines, they're producing too many PhDs and there's not enough jobs. So a lot of people that have PhDs in English and political science are finding it harder and harder to find actual tenure track jobs, and they're unfortunately being put in a precarious situation as temporary lecturers. Now that's a structural issue that we also have to challenge, because we don't need adjuncts, we need more job security and academic freedom. But on the contrary, within ethnic studies, just taking Berkeley, my old alma mater, as an example, they're all, it's all the rave about ratings, rankings and ratings, and how Berkeley is #1 public university, and their programs are like, numbered top 3 in their respective disciplines. And they're always parading all these numbers for all the traditional departments. But when it comes to placement, if you get a PhD in a traditional discipline, usually your um, job prospects become very limited, because you've been shaped and formed in one particular direction, and increasingly there's less jobs for you. But if you have a PhD in ethnic studies, at Berkeley in particular, we had one of the highest PhD to job ratios of the entire university, because we had people going into education, people going into the nonprofit sector, people going into social work, into philanthropy, people doing all kinds of different things, that the job placement rate was actually much higher than those in the ranked #3 in the country poli-sci department, or ranked in the top 10 English department, where their PhDs were only getting job at the between 85 to 88, 89%. And us, we had a 96% placement rate, right? So we definitely need to reframe how we think about ethnic studies, even post BA, post PhD.
Thank you. And on that note, I just dropped in we're on the search now for our full-time tenure track ethnic studies. So spread the word. Those are the possibilities, and those will be driven and growing. This sector in California specifically, due to the mandates at the community college, the CSU and the high schools.
Yeah, I mean, with these new requirements at the various levels, for us, it's become an important question of, well, who's going to teach ethnic studies at the high schools, right? And this is what has allowed us to make the claim to get the ethnic studies requirement at the CSU. So there's going to be growing opportunities both to teach at high school level, but also by extension, community college and CSU and UCs, because ethnic studies is a growing field.
Linda, go ahead. Linda, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I wanted to ask Roberto his definition differences between critical race theory and ethnic studies.
Yeah, I mean, I think lately, right, it's become in a non-academic setting, increasingly used interchangeably. But the reality is that critical race theory is a very specific subset of legal studies, right? So depending on the course, within ethnic studies, if you have, let's say, at Berkeley, there was a course in Chicano studies called Chicanos and the Law, right? And it was both historical, but also contemporary, and dealing with inequities in the criminal justice system, among other things. And critical race studies was a component, critical race theory was a component of the class, but the class as a whole was an ethnic studies course, right? So there's some overlap, but critical race theory is a very specific subset that's usually more in the context of legal studies. So you have people like Derek Bell, who wrote Faces at the Bottom of the Well, one of the founders of critical race theory, and others that we use in ethnic studies, but the two are not reducible to the same. They overlap, but are also different in their focuses.
Yeah, no, thank you. And also, this is, yeah, when we hear it out there, there's a lot of hoopla about that. But critical race, this is this legal approach that is used across disciplines, right? For example, I'm in political science. As a graduate student, I took a critical race theory approach to analyze the Constitution and the law and lawmaking processes throughout these historical moments. So, but it is, I know we're at time now, but this could be something we can take up. I just want to thank everybody. Sangha, do you want to close us out now? And
Oh, sure. Thank you to everyone who was here today. And very soon we will be thinking about putting together our Social Justice Day, which is usually in collaboration with our students and student clubs. If you are part of any clubs or advisors to any, please let's build together. This is one place where we come together as a community, and as Professor Hernàndez told us, like that's the only way we stay true and honest in this work. So let's build each other up in community. That's it for me.
let's go unmute and give a round of applause, everybody. We're trying to make it as intimate as possible. Here we go.
Thank you all. Thank
Right.
you.
So thank you, Dr. Hernàndez. We appreciate this. This is amazing. Really forcing us to reflect. All right. Thank you all. We'll send.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
I see you.
Thank you. Bye.
So I have one quick question, if that's okay, before.
Sure, Michael.
So he is in favor of implementing it in high schools and colleges as a required class that everybody, no matter what your major is, has to take. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just writing a report on it for my English class.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Have a great day, guys.
You too.
Okay. Are we good?
I think we're good.
Let me see. Hold
See,
on. Okay, let
Lucky
me
Charlotte
stop
and I
the
see you.
record.